On a hot summer day, specifically August 28, 1963, a speech was delivered to over 200,000 people surrounding the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., otherwise known as Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. I believe Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech to be one of the most famous and influential speeches ever given, not only in helping pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but in giving this country hope to end racism and discrimination. I have read, interpreted, and analyzed Dr. Martin Luther King's speech in order to educate myself on the topic of civil rights and racism. I owe credit to AmericanRhetoric.com for the text version of King's speech. The site is an index to and substantial database of full text transcriptions of the 100 most significant American political speeches of the 20th century. I've also received information from History.com, providing me with factual evidence over the history and settings of King's speech. Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. According to History.com, because of the passing of this act, segregation in public places ended, along with employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Thanks to King's speech, people of minority races are treated much differently than they were hundreds of years ago. Thanks to King's speech, your African American friends can do all the things you do, such as use public restrooms, drink out of the same water fountains, and work beside you at your place of employment. Today, I'd like to share with you a segment of Dr. Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech, discussing a defaulted promissory note, a hopeful new beginning that doesn't welcome discrimination that begins now, along with the dream of moving forward. The following is a segment from Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came out as a great beacon of light to hope millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro still languishes in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall here. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black as well as white men, would be guaranteed the undeniable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious that America has defaulted on that promissory note. Insofar as our citizens of color are concerned, instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great values of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fire urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or taking the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. The sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. And those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam will now be content with having a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. And there will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundation of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But there is something that I must say to people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new military which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to distrust of all white people, for many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they've come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. After discussing a defaulted promissory note from the Emancipation Proclamation, a hopeful new beginning that doesn't welcome discrimination proposed by Dr. King in his dream of moving forward, we should be able to better understand the importance of this influential and times-changing speech. After delivering this speech, I feel even more stronger about my opinion. That is, I believe that Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech to be one of the most famous and influential speeches ever given, not only in helping pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but in giving this country hope to end racism and discrimination. Without the help of AmericanRhetorical.com and History.com, I wouldn't have been educated enough to deliver to you this speech. These two educational websites help me better understand not only the importance of Dr. King's speech, but also the need to move forward. Just remember that next time you see people of all different races working together to make this world a better place, this speech was the beginning of all that. Thanks to this speech, the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, and this is the reason we can all stand together today, drink from the same fountains, use the same restroom, and work the same jobs. In light of today's situation, I think it's important that we're all reminded of this speech. Maybe we need a new beginning today, even 56 years later. Maybe we need to march ahead and not look back.